Okay, so this series of videos is about the analyst portion of the ISTE standards. So here's the analyst part that we're going to understand and use data to drive instruction and support students in achieving their learning goals. I want you to notice the emphasis on students here and their own goals. So the first is providing alternative ways to demonstrate competency and reflect on their learning. Then we're going to use technology for a variety of formative and summative assessments, which I'm going to talk about as well, about accommodating learner needs, providing feedback, and then informing instruction. And then using assessment data to guide progress and communicate with others, and to build student self-direction again. All right, so this first part of the video is mostly going to be on 2.7c, and then the second part is going to be more on the A and B. Because this first part, we're going to talk specifically about assessment and data, and then we're going to talk more about authentic assessments and alternative assessments. So assessment and data. So first of all, there's two primary types of assessment that educators usually talk about. The first is formative. So you might think of a chef. When a chef is cooking, they might taste their dish as they go. And they taste the dish to try to decide what to do next, if they want to add more salt or some other spice. That's what formative assessment is. It's getting a little sampling of how students are doing, what they're understanding, that can then inform what you're going to do next and what adjustments you need to make. The other type is summative, and that's kind of like in cooking shows when they have in front of judges and the judges taste the final product and do a judgment on it. Summative is kind of like when you give a test at the end of a unit to find out overall how students performed and to maybe give them a grade or decide whether or not they should progress to the next grade. That's summative. Now, in reality, just because something's summative doesn't mean that it's not going to inform future instruction. So really, I think it's a spectrum between formative assessment and summative assessment, because this cook is going to use what feedback he gets from the judges for the next time he makes something. So I don't think it's as clear-cut as sometimes we make it, but those are the two main types. So next question is, why are we doing this? Why are we assessing? And there's a few reasons. One, so that we continually adapt and refine instruction. That's that formative assessment. So we know how students are doing and we can help them do better. Another is to actually target individual students who are struggling. So assessments can help us identify which students are learning to read well and which ones aren't, which students might need intervention with certain skills. It also can support student reflection and self-directed learning. Remember that in the ISTE standards. Students can see their scores, and that can help them know what to focus on, what to direct their learning on. Kind of like you took the Technology Integration Competency Survey, and that gave you scores that you could use to direct your own learning. That's where that comes from. And then finally, you can use it to evaluate the learning design in your own teaching. So you can use that to improve. If I can look and see what my students do and use that to improve what I do as a teacher and how I design activities in courses and such. So assessment requires data. We have to have some type of information that we can do this formative and summative assessment with. And we usually think of that as quantitative data. So that's things like test scores, quiz scores. It could be percentages like attendance percentages or other types of numeric measures. It's important, though, to also think about qualitative data. When a teacher hears a student answer a question, they immediately make a judgment about whether or not to continue on that topic or to move on to something else. When a teacher sees a student staring out the window, that helps them make a judgment about how well instruction is going and whether or not students are engaged. And those are really valuable indicators that I think we need to remember. Other qualitative things are like open-ended responses or essays, or when students create things and make things. That gives us really good information about what they know. It's just not this quantitative numeric data. Quantitative data is more, you can look at their engagement level in learning activities, especially with technologies. You can see how much time they spend on different activities. Performance assessments like tests, interaction, what they do with different tools, and there's actually a little bit of a trend now to start tracking student behavior, and you can think about whether you agree with doing that or not. It's a little bit murky whether that's appropriate. But we tend as a society, at least in the United States, we tend to focus on this quantitative numeric data because it's easy. And it's a hard number that seems true no matter what, and it's easy to compare. But just because it's easy doesn't necessarily mean it's the best or most accurate way of understanding how students learn and identify skills and weaknesses. This video is focused on authentic assessment. This is assessment that goes beyond just answering questions on a test to actually producing something. So here's a good definition of authentic assessment. It's the idea of using creative learning experiences to test students' skills and knowledge in realistic situations. It measures students' success in a way that's relevant to the skills required of them once they finish your course or degree program. So rather than being about passing a test, it's really trying to assess learning experiences that are real outside of the classroom. And those words realistic and relevant are keywords here. So we're just going to take a quick step back. So remember, this is about assessment, but before we can assess something, we have to identify what it is we want to assess. What do we want the students to learn that we're then able to assess? So we're going to talk a little bit about learning outcomes, what we want students to learn. And there's a lot of learning outcomes out there that we have to use that are usually pretty detailed. But we're going to look at the bigger picture of learning outcomes and think about what do you want your students to remember or be able to do in 10 years. So I like this chart for it. There's some things that are worth being familiar with, right? There's other things that are really important to know and do. And there's some things we need a deep and enduring understanding of. And whenever we're creating learning outcomes or to figure out what we want students to learn and do, we need to make sure that we're remembering these categories, that some things we really want to go deep into because they're so important. So some questions to ask as you start considering learning outcomes is like, what do experts in the discipline do? What ways do they think in? What can help students understand the world? What do you actually use in your life? How does it impact your life? And what do I want to go beyond this lesson? You know, what needs to be there in 10 years? So one framework I really like is New Zealand has this very nice website on their curriculum. And so I'm going to start with these key competencies. These are kind of like their things that they definitely want students to know and do and be competent of that cut across a lot of different content areas. So you can see they're pretty general. They need to be able to think, relate to others, use language, symbols, and texts, manage themselves, and participate and contribute to society. So those are general competencies that you can develop through all kinds of different content areas. Then they have really specific things from different content areas. So for example, this is about English, where they say, what is English about and why are we studying English? This really gets to what do students need to know in 10 years. So once you've identified these learning outcomes, the next step is to figure out a way to determine whether or not students have met these learning objectives. And when we're doing these learning outcomes that are so broad, it can be tricky to assess them because multiple choice tests often don't get at it. So that's why we get to this authentic assessment using creative learning experiences. That's when they actually have to do something to show. They might make something, they might give a speech or a presentation, they might have an interview with someone. There's all kinds of examples. I'm going to give you some more examples in a minute. But they're going to do something that's more realistic and creative, which goes with our PICRAT, right? Where we're trying to get up to this creative area of learning. So then we say, so what can students create? I have a few examples just from some of my students. For example, this is one. this is one that Annie did. This is called the Nile News. So say you had students studying Egypt and you want them to really understand how Egyptian society worked and the role of the Nile in Egyptian society. You might ask them to, or give them the option to, create a newspaper as if they were living in Egypt and the Nile was starting to inundate the area. This was created using a tool called Flipstack. And so by doing this, the students both are able to learn while they do it, and you're able to see whether or not they've developed the understanding that you're hoping for. Caitlin created this fake Instagram post. So her class was reading a book written by Trevor Noah. And so she created a Instagram post for Trevor, and that helped her think about the different aspects of this person's life and what the main beliefs and goals of this person are, because that's the type of thing they might be posting about on Instagram. Here's another social media example, Twitter discussions. So this was built on something called TweetGen. There's others as well where you can create fake Twitter discussions. But Stephanie wanted to focus on point of view and character traits. And so her students read a book called Julian Tells. And this is an example of a Twitter feed where students would have to think about each different character and how the characters would discuss a single event or topic. So they're really pulling into the point of view and character traits of each one. And they're also thinking about how we communicate in today's world in a networked society. So here's some more examples that I think go just a little bit deeper than those. This is one I did with some students. It wasn't overly deep, but I was trying, my enduring understanding was that I wanted my students to carefully consider how communication is affected by technologies. And I wanted them to develop some digital literacy skills and be able to express themselves using technologies. And then I also thought it was worth being familiar, that they would be familiar with different, the history of communication technologies. And so I asked them to create Flipgrid videos where they pretended like they were someone in a different time period, and they told a story from the perspective of that person. So here's a student that pretended she was a baseball announcer in the 1980s. And so she talked about the forecasting and the types of microphone and that really only the people in the stadium could hear her or the people on the radio. And so by doing that, they had to do some research and they had to learn to do these things. And I could see whether or not they were connecting the relationship between society and communications technologies. Last example, this was one of my students who did this with her students in a summer program. They created this Hydro Beings project. So these are her students. And they created these hydro beings, these characters that are part of the water cycle. So they had to research different parts of the water cycle, and then they used those to tell a story. And in other things, like they created this chess set. It's kind of random, but they created a chess set with their characters. It's something good to do one day. But what was really transformative for this is that not only did they talk about the water cycle from the angle of these characters, but they connected it to environmental awareness. So understanding water scarcity from one of the characters' perspectives and how that interacts with the water cycle. So this book was created by Bookymon, a really easy way for students to create books, and then you can do it for free online, but you can also have order the books, the printed books, if you want to pay for it. And then this is just like a basic poster made probably using Canva. I don't know what it was made with, but the idea is that these students are learning about the water cycle. They're connecting it to some environmental activism. And at the same time, the teacher is able to see what students are understanding for that authentic assessment. All right. Takeaways from the analyst videos. First takeaway, there's a lot of tools for collecting data and assessing student progress. Always use several data sources. So some of them are better than others. Don't rely on one, but do use them to inform your instruction. And then creative authentic assessments can support digital literacy development, so that's creating those products, and help students demonstrate their learning to you. So it's sort of a win-win. All right, thanks for watching.